we can move on to the next presentation. And we have Stavros Assimakopoulos presenting his work, discriminatory discourse, argumentative inference, and relevance. I leave you some time to set up, and then you can start whenever you are ready.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Great, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Cheers. And can you see my slides? Yes, okay, excellent.
Yes,
So
we
I'll
can.
start. Thanks so much. So I should start off by saying that this is not my work exclusively. So this is the result of work that I've done with Dimitri Serafis, who did his postdoc with me on, well, it was in critical discourse studies. But the relevance theoretic bit and the main conception of this, I could say, is my brainchild. Okay, so let me start off. I mean, the way I've framed the abstract has been basically on the basis of critical discourse studies. And this is important because the main point that I want to make in this talk is not so much related. Well, it is related. Obviously, there is something to add to relevance theory, or to further knowledge about relevance theory, but it has to do mainly with discrimination and how relevance theory can help address issues there. So basically, critical discourse studies, for those of you who are not in the knowledge of the field, has focused on the ways in which discourses reproduce opaque meanings that perpetuate social inequalities. And these ways are more often than not indirect rather than direct. And here is a quote by Hart, one of the main people in the field. The role of the critical discourse analyst, who is equipped with a theoretical I need to move my, okay. With theoretical tools required to look behind language use is to use their expertise to bring to the level of public consciousness instances of manipulation and ideology not immediately apparent to average readers, thus empowering these average readers with a new critical awareness. So the point here is basically that even though we know that there is, a lot of homophobia, xenophobia, whatever have you, all the isms that are in the word, they are communicated in discourse. They're not always overtly communicated. However, they still provide some rationale that backs up and ultimately legitimizes the homophobic or xenophobic stance that they are communicating. Well, not communicate. I wouldn't use the word communicate. They are conveying against some particular social group. And the aim of this talk is basically to try and explain a bit how this process works by using a synthesis of argumentation theory and relevance theory, basically. So, as most of you would know, I mean, my main concern and my main work has been on the critical discourse study stuff has been on the analysis of hate speech. And I'm not going to be drawing the distinction that I usually draw in this particular talk because it's a bit more general. Let's assume that hate speech is the legal thing, right? The stuff that you can go to jail for, right? Or you can get a huge fine for. And hate speech in this sense, in the legal sense of the term, typically involves making an overt suggestion about an uncivil course of action. And usually this is justified by additional argumentation. Like, but nobody would go on and say, kill all X, Y, Z without this. By the way, a disclaimer, I will use a couple of examples that might be distressing for some people, so apologies in advance, but this is to make the point. So if you're not, comfortable with looking at them, I would like to ask you to leave. However, the problem with, I mean, and I think that I think we can all agree that this is an ever-growing problem, especially in this day and age, and the way in which politics is, evolving. We know now, after a lot of research, that hate speech is just a very, very tiny portion of all the discourse that could be thought of as discriminatory overall, right? And at the same time, we also know that even though hate speech does exist, in the public sphere, the way in which it emerges is through this covert expression. So it's actually more covert expression that creates the conditions for the rise in hate speech, and not just that, also hate crime. And here there are two classic examples that are well attested in the literature. It has now been shown that the whole anti-Semitic sentiment that led to the Holocaust and whatnot started through mentions of, through reference to Jews as vermin by the Nazi government. And more recently, there has been a lot of studies that showed that there is a correlation between the reference of then and when, unfortunately now, to President Trump to COVID as the Chinese virus and crime against Asian Americans in the United States. So basically, the thing is that, things seem to be starting a bit, on the low key, and then suddenly, you have all these like prosecutable actions, let's say. So what is it that allows discriminatory attitudes to get normalized through covert discursive reproduction? And the thing is, I mean, we all have a hunch about how this works, but I want to try and zoom in a bit about to the actual process that leads to this thing. So the proposal that I'm going to be putting forward today is that this is a function. So discriminatory attitudes get normalized uh, even if the communication of the relevant messages is covert, due to the way in which we interpret communicated meaning. This is the relevance theoretic bit. And at the same time, due to the fact that discriminatory discourse, like all discourse, exhibits some inherent argumentativity. And I'm going to talk about these two things separately and then try to synthesize them. So to begin with, I'm going to give you, and thank God, you're all familiar with relevance theory, so I don't need to go into a lot of detail, which is usually the case in talks like this. Because I've usually given this talk to CDS people. So relevance theory offers an account of the mental processes that underlie spontaneous interpretation, and it does so by drawing on principles from evolutionary psychology. And the upshot of the argumentation, or at least what I'm interested in this particular talk, is that once a communicative stimulus catches your attention, or an ostensive, as they like to call it now, catches our attention, we cannot help but automatically work out the speaker intended import by assessing interpretive hypothesis in order of accessibility. So, but this is basically the path of least effort that guides comprehension more generally. Now, how this happens, as again we all know, this is by drawing conclusions, what are called in relevance theory positive cognitive effects, on the basis of two premises. The premises being the semantic representation of the stimulus, of the linguistic stimulus that you have at hand, and the context, i.e., the set of assumptions that get selected and become activated in our mind. Now, for me, the most important innovation of relevance theory, apart from all the accolades has received through the years, is that basically it showcases that speaker meaning is not an endpoint in itself, right? Speaker meaning is sort of like a way of getting across coming up with cognitive effects when it comes to interpreting. So as Wilson S. Berber suggested back in the day, the goal of the interpretation process, as we see it, is not merely to classify an utterance as a type of speech act or whatever have you that give multiple options, but to work out the logical consequences of adding it to a pre-existing stock of beliefs and assumptions to which the hearer has access. And obviously, the stock of beliefs and assumptions refers to the context in relevance theory. And very, very quickly, these logical consequences are what positive cognitive effects are supposed to account for. And these arise in interpretation in three ways, as well known. The unification of some explicitly expressed content with a context that is automatically activated and gives rise to contextual implications. So basically implicatures that can give rise through the union of content and context. When some assumptions in the context are strengthened, or when some assumptions in the context are revised or abandoned. This is standard RT, so I'm not going to dwell on this all that much. What needs to be added to this picture, however, especially after Tim's plenary this morning, is that we need to also try and find a way of accommodating non-propositional effects like affective effects. Earlier on, colleague would talk about perceptual effects, which might not be on par, but again, it's something that we need to take into account. And I've recently talked about ideological effects, which have to do with stances and attitudes rather than pure emotions. It's a connection of belief and emotion, if you will. But for now, let's stick to the old picture where we're talking about cognitive effects. But I'm assuming when I'm talking about cognitive effects, like Tim suggested this morning, that these include all these other non-propositional effects as well. Now, obviously, from a relevance theoretic perspective, an utterance, linguistic utterance, or any type of discursive practice, the function is to provide highly precise and informative evidence of the communicator's intention. And here is where I'm starting with the examples, so apologies in advance for the offensive content. The first example is actually an example of a case from, where a Greek priest, actually he's no longer a priest, engaged in hate speech. He has been, condemned of this in court and whatever have you. And this was obviously homophobic hate speech. So basically referring to gay people and those who support them as scum of society. He said the scum of society are raising their heads, tell it like it is, spit on them. Obviously, here we have a case of hate speech, and now it has been, established even in legal proceedings and even at the European Court. This statement is an ambiguously hate speech because the bishop explicitly suggests a civil course of action, and it's a public message as well, right? So the spit on them bit constitutes and more things that he said this. Uh, Obviously, he wouldn't say it on its own, right? He would offer some arguments to support why people should spit on them. And in the accompanying text, this was a blog post, by the way, right? That was posted on his personal blog, but accessed by a lot of people. He offers several supporting arguments for his suggestion. He's saying homosexuality is a diversion from the laws of nature. It's a social crime. It's a sin. I mean, he has many, many, many other negative, let's say, expressions against homosexual people. And I think that here, if we are to reconstruct a bit the standpoint, like his standpoint, his recommendation, if you will, is that people should spit on gay people because, and then he offers all these supporting arguments, right? Now, if we are to compare this, so here we have a case of overt expression of hate, or an overt expression of incitement, basically, to discriminatory hatred. Now, now we can also look at the other side of the equation, which are basically utterances where you don't really have any overtness, but still you have some portrayal in a negative manner, let's say. And here I'm drawing from earlier work that I've done again with Dimitris, which I'm drawing on a corpus of comments that were taken from Greek news portals. And basically, these comments now are reactions specifically to a news article that reported on the Gay Pride Parade in Thessaloniki, in Greece. This is a rough translation, but I mean, you get the point. How times have changed. Hell is starting to spread on earth. And there's nothing here that is prosecutable or anything of the sort, right? It's just a negative stance against the Gay Pride Parade. If you go out half naked in Tsimiski with a dildo on your head, it's impossible for anyone to take you seriously. Tsimiski is a main street in Thessaloniki. And then this doesn't translate really well. It's supposed to be a fun comment, a ridiculing comment. Again, the straight will all get into entangled. There is an expression in Greek, if there's any Greeks here, malya kouvaria, which is supposed to be, a humorous, let's say, comment, but again, condemning of the general attitude. Here, the commenters target the behavior of the participants of the Gay Pride Parade, but what they say is not an act of incitement, it's not hate speech. Still, it is discriminatory, I hope you will all agree, in the sense that it perpetuates a negative stance towards the LGBTIQ individuals by representing at least some of them, those who take part in the Pride Parade, in a bad light. And I think that if we were to reconstruct a bit, and I mean, I'm trying to point you towards the argument that I'm going to make in the end, this is that people here are not saying hate gay people, but what they're saying is basically they're providing reasons for you to hate gay people. So gay parade or homosexual behavior is sinful in the case of the first example, ridiculous, ludicrous, and whatever have you. So they are essentially begging for you to reach the standpoint that this is not okay and we should stop them or whatever have you. And importantly, this might not even be intentional. This might be just a comment in passing or whatever have you. Now, if we are to sort of combine what relevance theory says about spontaneous interpretation and the study of discrimination and this distinction between, overt and covert expression of discriminatory attitudes, a very interesting conclusion comes up. And I think that the important aspect of this, at least from the critical stance that I want to take in this talk, is that since we do not intervene in the interpretation process, it just runs its course following the comprehension heuristic. There's no way we can stop it or whatever have you. It's just automatic. These effects, so basically the negative stance and attitude, which are both cognitive and emotional and affective, sorry, and whatever have you, are derived automatically. It means that we have no way of, stopping them from being derived. So this leads to a very important conclusion, that is that the more negatively valenced discourse you encountered in relation to a minority group, the more prone you will be to be affected by it. And what I will end up this talk with is by saying that basically the more prone you're going to be negatively affected by it. So as opposed to the case of hate speech in one, like the spit on them example, where we have an explicit incitement on a civil act, in the case of comments like the ones in two, our attention is not drawn to some relevant standpoint. So how can we basically suggest that these are also discriminatory just because they slightly ridicule or they say something that's merely negative or whatever have you? Like discrimination is a very theoretically charged term, right? And I think that the important thing to note here is that um, in this case, I don't want to suggest that these people intended to be discriminatory or whatever have you. There is this distinction in discourse analysis which talks about discourse perpetuating things without being intentional, right? And this is what I want to say. And I think that this can be well tied with the distinction that the relevance theory draws between comprehension and interpretation. And basically, as Wilson has purpose suggested, the interpretation process involves the derivation not only of specifically intended logical consequences, but also of those that are less specifically intended or even unintended. So the point that I want to make is that, all these effects that you're getting that lead you to developing a discriminatory stance are basically the result of the interpretation process that naturally takes place. And here is where I want to merge things with argumentation studies. And the reason why I'm using argumentation studies is because it can give you an extra layer of information, let's say, or an extra layer, an extra layer of information at the microanalytic level on how you can decompose a bit the process of arriving at the relevant inferences. So all language using context, and that is discourse basically, has an inherent argumentative potential. This has also been called argumentativity. It has many different ways, but basically what this suggests is that any type of discourse, even if it doesn't participate in a formal debate or disclose a manifest persuasive purpose, has an underlying argumentative dimension. So basically whatever we say has the power to change someone's opinion or to argue against or for a particular position. And when Amosi discusses this, when talking about the new wave in argumentation studies, she actually discusses this in a way that really resonated to me from a relevance theoretic perspective. So, for example, she says discourse always answers some explicit or hidden question, or at least suggests a way of looking at the surrounding world. Like this is a cognitive effect to a certain extent, right? And if you are to combine it with the relevance theoretic perspective, the answer to the question is this is a search for relevance. Discourse acts upon an addressee by modifying or strengthening his or her representations of the surrounding world. Now, this is, again, very, very akin to what cognitive effects are. And the upshot of what this research in argumentation studies says is that discourses implicitly but reasonably still lead us to infer standpoints in context. And the way and one of the nice things about the framework that I'm using for this particular talk, which is the argumentative model of topics, is that it looks at this from an inferential perspective, which I think ties really well with relevance theory. So in this context, inference involves a cognitive move. There you go, like there is a cognitive aspect to it, from something that is known for the arguers, i.e. an argument, to something that is not known and must be proven, i.e. the standpoint. So basically we have a derivation process that involves cognition. And I mean, this is highly technical, so I'll try to break it down in easy terms, but bear with me. So the argumentative model of topics essentially provides a way of breaking down argumentative inference. And I think that it does so in a way that ties in really well with how relevance theory discusses non-demonstrative inference. And here is a graphical representation. Don't get off-put by the complexity of this. It's quite simple, actually. On the one hand, you have what is called the procedural inferential component. So these are the inference rules, let's say, that you're using in deriving a standpoint. Now, the locus is outside the basic configuration because it's the ontological semantic basis of the argument. Things like if something has a cause, then it has an effect, and whatever have you. So this is not part of the derivation. What is part of the derivation are the maxims, which are the principles or the rules that stem from the locus. So, for example, because we have cause-effect things out there in the world, if a cause is present, the effect will be present too. And that is how the maxim sort of works. And then at the same time, what it does is it introduces also the material contextual component, which is the actual, I think, interpretation of a particular statement or whatever have you. And this is made up of the endoxon and the datum. Now, in the picture that I'm going to be describing, the datum is basically the factual premise or the representational meaning of the utterance that you're analyzing, let's say from an argumentative perspective. And then the endoxon is the accepted knowledge in context. And this is what I want to say is quite similar to contextual, to how relevance theory discusses context, right? So the idea here is basically that when you have the initial interpretation of something, you come up with a conclusion, and then in order to figure out whether this conclusion has some argumentative dimension, you can actually couple it with a maxim and then draw a final conclusion, which is the standpoint in this particular sense. So let me try and put it down in terms of an example. This is a bit complex. I hope you can see the derivation here. So basically, the locus, as I said, is an ontological thing. That's why you get this type of signage here. There is a locus from termination and setting up, and the maxim that results from this, or the rule, the inference rule you have in this case is, if something is bad, then something must be stopped. And here we have, this is the hate speech example from before. Spit on these disgraced people, condemn them, blacken them, they're not human beings, they're freaks of nature, they suffer psychologically and spiritually. So what he suggests in this particular part of his discourse is that homosexuals suffer psychologically and spiritually. This is the actual explicit meaning, right? And then we can get from contextual information that suffering psychologically and spiritually is a bad thing, obviously, right? It's not a good thing. So we need to somehow deal with it. And this is where the maxim comes in, right? So the first conclusion is that the homosexual suffering must be stopped because suffering is bad. And then if something is bad, then something must be stopped is the maxim that gives us the final conclusion, which is engaging in civil actions because that's way in spitting and condemning and blackening homosexuals, because this is a way of treating their suffering, right? So basically, this is the standpoint, this is the justification, let's say, for the initial bit for the standpoint that is explicitly defended here. The same can go with they are not human beings, they are freaks of nature. Again, homosexuals are not human beings, but freaks of nature. Being a freak of nature is a bad thing, so homosexuals are bad. This is the initial thing that the initial conclusion that you can derive from the interpretation. And then again, by the same maxim, if X is bad, then X must be stopped. Engage in a civil action against homosexual, because that's how you're gonna stop them if you spit on them and condemn them and blacken them. And finally, he refers to them as disgraced people. Again, the exact same rationale comes up here. So homosexuals are disgraced people. Disgrace is something bad or reflects shame. So they are bad and shameful, which means that if they're bad and shameful, we need to engage in this and civil action in order to stop them eventually. And if you can, and as you can see, like, this becomes a really complex thing where you basically have a lot of reasons that leads to the same, to similar first conclusions, all of which justify through the use of the maxim the engagement in the civil action. And this, in this case, is an explicit standpoint, right? This is something that's defended explicitly. Now, turning to just one of the examples from the implicit side or the covertly communicated side, we have things like we have the comment, how times have changed, hell is spreading on earth. And here we can, if we are to, again, deconstruct the argument. We have first the utterance times have changed. This in a context like we know from experience that times change when there are changes in collective norms and behaviors or whatever have you. Like this needs to mean something, and this leads to the conclusion that if times have changed and this is how usually they change, there needs to be something that's responsible for times changing. Uh, and basically, this is derived from the maxim, from the locus from effect to cause, and the maxim that suggests that if the effect is present, its cause will be present too. So basically, the conclusion that comes from the unification of the first conclusion with the maxim is that time has changed because homosexuality is becoming prominent and acceptable of society. That's given by the context, obviously, right? In similar terms, we can, sorry. Yeah, it shouldn't have been like that. Hell is starting to spread on Earth. Hell is associated with deviant or sinful behavior. Hell is spreading on Earth because some sinful or deviant behavior is becoming prominent. Again, the maxim from cause to effect gives us that hell is starting to spread on Earth because homosexuality is becoming prominent and acceptable in society. So all of this is now becoming, we're going from the explicit side to the more implicit side, right? And if we are to combine these two, we can get this implicit datum. So basically the implicit utterance, let's say, not utterance, the implicit meaning that hell is spreading on earth and times have changed because we are accepting of homosexuals. And then we have the common knowledge that hell is a bad place to be. So homosexuality becoming prominent, acceptable in society is bad. And then again, from the previous locus of termination of setting up, if something is bad, then something must be stopped. We can again derive the same implicit, this time, standpoint that homosexuality needs to be stopped or homosexual behavior needs to be stopped. So this is an implicit standpoint here. I do hope I wasn't going too fast, but anyway. So if we are to synthesize the two perspectives, I think there's a lot of overlap here, and I think that there is a way in which one complements the other, especially the AMT complements relevance theory in breaking down the inferential processing at this time. The crucial aspect when discussing the normalization of discriminatory attitudes to discursive reproduction is that the relevant standpoint is not explicitly expressed necessarily by the speaker. And so building up on the relevance theoretic rationale, the AMT offers a principal way of breaking down the derivation of the relevant cognitive effects or ideological effects, if you want to call them that, because there is an emotional aspect to them as well. So given textual and contextual premises, and this is the relevance theoretic bit, so the endoxon and the datum would correspond roughly to the utterance and the context. And then by combining them with inference rules, which are just reasonable, let's say, rules that you follow when you engage in argumentation, you arrive at standpoints, which can be both explicit or implicit. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I hope I'm okay. So standpoints are very likely to derive as reasonable conclusions, probably weak implicatures on the basis of the premises that the speaker message gives rise to. So basically, in the case of covert discriminatory discourse, basically all this negativity gives you the impression, yes, that they don't want them, they don't, they don't like homosexual people or whatever minority you have them. So basically, you have the first step is pride parade is hell on earth. Hell is bad. Behavior at the parade should be stopped because hell is bad. So this is the simple, let's say, thing. And then the contextual link to the LGBTIQ individuals as the main actors of the pride parade can also lead you to the conclusion that the individuals themselves need to be stopped. It's not just the parade that's the problem. It's the people that take part in the parade that's a problem. So to make it a bit clearer, on the one hand, we have spontaneous interpretation according to relevance theory, where you get cognitive effects that are drawn inferentially on the basis of the semantic content of an utterance and the hearer's assumptions that are brought to bear in the interpretation process. And then you have argumentative inferences, according to the argumentative model of topics, where you get the first conclusions or minor premises, which are drawn inferentially on the basis of the datum, which is the factual premise, like what is suggested by the semiotic resource, I would say, at hand, and the endoxon, the accepted knowledge in context. And then on top of this, you also get the maxims, which give you inferences about standpoints, like what this person wants to defend when it comes to this. So I think that there is a way in which, I'm not saying that there's 100% match here, but I think that there is a way in which, when discussing discourse and when talking about this specific context, the datum is sort of coextensive with the content of the utterance. I'm not going to call it semantic specifically. And the endoxon is coextensive with the context of the utterance. And the important thing here is that these inferences about the defendant standpoints, which are implicit, are automatically drawn. And as Sperber and colleagues have very nice put it, yes, I'm wrapping up. Sorry, Ismail. It's actually the last slide. So people are near collegible cognitive optimists. They take for granted that their spontaneous cognitive processes are highly reliable and that the output of these processes does not need rechecking. So just like they trust their perceptions, they trust their spontaneous inferences and their intuitions of relevance. So basically, this is not just automatic; it's foolproof, right? It sort of enters our cognitive environment without us even realizing it. So the AMT shows how the move from relevant premises to a discriminatory standpoint is made, while relevance theory suggests that this move is inevitable in spontaneous interpretation. What I think is the most troubling, let's say, or weird thing about this is that the resulting effects are always conducive to social inequality. They're always condemning to the minority group. So for one who has a negative attitude, this attitude will be strengthened. For someone who has a positive attitude, this attitude will be challenged, and it could lead to revising or eliminating or to reacting very vocally. And for someone who has a neutral attitude, they'll get reasons to develop a negative stance altogether. Thank you for the apologies for taking up more time than I should. And this has just been published in Critical Discourse Studies. So if you want to read up more, please go ahead. Thank you.
Very in-depth presentation. Thank you very much, Stavros. If you're not too hungry, you can ask away questions, and then we can eat something before the next panel. So go ahead.
Are you saying I should go ahead? Okay, thanks,
Yes.
Stavros. That was really interesting. I did wonder whether it was one of the implications of your work about this idea that discriminatory and hateful speech is processed automatically, has certain, I mean, whether you want to draw the further conclusion that this is a bad thing because if we allow it to go by, we are kind of reinforcing it, even the neutral people are, by not challenging it, we're allowing it to sort of, I don't know if you know the work of Gillian Russell. She's a philosopher who's in Australia. Her view is that if you don't challenge these kinds of hateful speeches, you are, in a sense, accommodating them. You're allowing their negative presuppositions to get into the common ground, and you should have challenged them.
There is, absolutely, 100%. I mean, one of the main points here is that, I've adopted explicitly the critical discourse studies perspective because it is an activistic perspective, right? I mean, we are supposed to call it out and whatever. At the same time, one of the main findings of all research on hate speech is that basically the more it accumulates, like both in its covert and overt form or whatever have you, the less the harder it is for people who are just normal citizens going about doing their own job to question this point, because it dominates sort of public discourse, as it has happened, I'm sure, in several countries, which makes, hatred, discrimination, whatever, social inequality stand there. So yeah, I'm definitely on board with going forward. And in the paper, that's the final note we're making. Like, we need to intervene. And we need to intervene by educating people rather than, by telling them don't say this or that or the other, right? By explaining how this process works and why it's bad, for equality. So yes, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the note on Russell. I was familiar with the work, but I'll go back to it for sure. Thank you.
I have a question. And
Sure.
well, first off, thank you very much. And it provided lots of very interesting insights on how these effects could come about. And I was wondering about those effects. Those negative effects, could they also bring a change in people who don't buy into religious stuff? Like they have these premises in their minds, but they just are not they don't necessarily believe in them. Do you think it still changes those people's minds, like in long term? I'm talking about long term effects, if you will.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that. No, I think I get what you're getting at, but I mean, if you think about it, like all the discussion about indoctrination at schools and whatever have you is a
mhm,
direct result of this process. I mean, it's basically, if you hear something again and again and again and again and again, it's going to infiltrate your beliefs. And it can infiltrate in multiple ways. Like you can either accept it, you can not accept it, or whatever have you. The problem with all this is that apart from the social injustice and
mm,
inequality, it also creates like upheaval. Like if you think about it, this is also relevant when it comes to even um, like the Me Too movement, or social movements that are going against. Like suddenly something sort of dominates discourse,
mhm,
and people are getting scared to talk about it or whatever have you, because it's no longer part of the dominant public discourse. So yes, I
yeah,
think that this is generally inevitable, and in a way, yes, it's not it's a it could explain. I mean, okay, we're going at a very meta level now, but it would explain
yeah,
how people get so hung up on religion or so hung up on X or Y or Z, to a certain extent. And again, I think that the important point here is that this is not just cognitive. I think I can't stress this enough. I think that there is a mixture of like information, beliefs, and whatnot, and some emotional trigger or something that sticks to it in a different way, in an effective manner.
yeah. So repetition gives like an objective aspect to those discourses, or where all they cement. So even those who don't believe in such things, right? They
There is
seem,
experimental evidence on that. So there was
yeah.
another paper I had looked at. There is experimental evidence that people that listen to the same thing over and over again tend to, apart from the confirmation bias, they might actually go against their own like thought,
Oh, yeah.
if they listen to it again and again and again from everyone. So there is this effect. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Very interesting. So, well, if there's no other questions, I think we can enjoy a short lunch.